In the small town of Durango, situated on the shores of the ancient rock formations of northern Arizona, Bruce Ethan Carter was 17 years old and had a passion for mystery stories and indigenous legends. Ever since he was a child, he had heard stories about creatures that inhabited the desert regions and forests that surrounded his home. Stories that his grandparents told around the campfire, their voices trembling and their eyes shining with fear and fascination. But as Bruce Ethan grew older, he began to realize that some of these stories carried a truth that went beyond the imaginative. A truth that involved entities that many called skinwalkers, beings capable of transforming into animals or humans, driven by unseen and dark forces that hovered in the darkness of the desert. Bruce Ethan's home was a few miles from downtown Durango, on a secluded street surrounded by gnarled trees and dry bushes that seemed to rustle in the wind. The block was quiet most of the time, especially at night. The sky there, unpolluted by light, unveiled a tapestry of stars, and the full moon cast a pale light over the surrounding sandy terrain. This was the kind of scenery that from the inside inspired awe and a hint of uneasiness. After all, the region was known for its stories of strange encounters, unexplained phenomena, and visions that seemed to defy logic. It was a September night when the air seemed heavier than usual. Bruce Ethan was in his living room, surrounded by books of native legends, engraved that his grandfather had inherited from an old Navajo ancestor, and his laptop, with the screen still on, illuminating his young, attentive face. The clock was 11:30 p.m. He felt tired, but something in the outside environment seemed to be talking to an instinctive part of his mind, a whisper that came from the silence of the night, a foreboding that grew with each passing minute. He looked out the window, from where he could see the backyard garden, almost too dark to make out details. The vegetation at that moment seemed to hide in the dim light, as if sharing a secret with the darkness. Bruce Ethan has always had a relationship of fascination and fear with that space. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that routine of old stories that his grandparents insisted on reinforcing, especially as summer drew to a close. But that night, something different was in the air. The bushes around the garden were beginning to look more alive, their shadows as shapes that dragged along the wall of twisted logs. Bruce Ethan took a deep breath and tried to focus on the words of his books, reading about the legend of the Skinwalker, an entity that, according to Navajo accounts, was a cursed shaman, capable of transforming his essence into a desert creature, be it a wolf, a fox, or even a human figure deformed by darkness. Each description created a knot in his stomach, a mixture of fascination and fear that seemed to become palpable. Suddenly, a barely audible whisper pierced the silence of the night, a sound that seemed to come from inside the yard. Bruce Ethan froze, his eyes fixed on the window, trying to understand if it had been just an illusion or something more. The wind, which normally blew lightly, suddenly seemed colder and stronger, shaking the trees as if to tear them from the ground. He knew that in those regions the wind carried ancient stories, the voices of ancestors who watched and watched from above, hidden in the shadow of the mountains. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. Bruce Ethan took out his handheld flashlight, which he always carried just in case, and turned on the high-intensity light. His eyes flickered in the sudden light, but he didn't hesitate. Slowly, she walked to the glass door that led to the backyard, searching in the darkness for any clue as to what might be there. In an attempt to convince himself that it was just a game of his mind, Bruce Ethan tried to rationalize it. It was the wind, a tree having its branches standing on end, a nocturnal animal strolling by. However, what caught his attention was a subtle change in the shade of one of the trees near the wooden enclosure. The shadow seemed to lengthen in an abnormal way, moving against the natural rhythm of the wind. when he pointed the flashlight. In the direction of that point, she could barely cross the dim light. The shadow moved, almost as if it was slowly dragging in the opposite direction, like a presence that shouldn't be there. Bruce Ethan's heart raced. He felt his body stiffen. The air seemed to grow colder and heavier. The hand holding the flashlight trembled, but he tried to stay focused, insisting that it was just an illusion. A play of light and shadow, a hallucination caused by fear and fatigue. Still, one doubt persisted. If it were a creature, an animal, or even a spiritual entity related to the Navajo legend, it could be there, in the darkness of its own backyard, watching silently, waiting for the moment to act. He took a deep breath, tried to calm the fast heartbeat, and decided to stay there at the door, attentive. The nights in that region always had something extraordinary. A light that crosses the sky, a strange sound coming from the caves, an invisible force that seems to whisper in the shadows. Bruce Ethan knew deep down that this was just the beginning of a night that promised to take away his deepest insecurities and fears, if there was a difference between them. At that moment, the silence was broken by a slight creaking from the garden, as if something was moving slowly through the bushes. Bruce Ethan held his breath. His eyes fiercely tried to catch any detail in the dark, while the first feeling that he was not alone took hold in his mind. It was the beginning of a night that would change your perception of reality, a night when the old fear of what dwells in the darkness would finally reveal itself. And in Durango, Arizona, what was hidden in the shade of that garden, no one could have imagined. The silence in the night seemed heavy, almost palpable, as Bruce Ethan stood at the glass door, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the garden. The shadow that had previously moved slowly now seemed to be stationary, frozen in its position. His breath was short, his body tense, as if he was trying to control a feeling that something invisible was really watching him. The wind continued to whistle through the trees, but the sound began to mingle with small noises, light, barely perceptible footsteps that seemed to move toward his house. It was as if the air itself was carrying echoes of something that should never be there. Bruce Ethan took a few seconds to process it, his heart pounding, his mind fighting the absurd idea that he might be seeing a real creature. But the sense of a distinct, unnatural presence took root deeper and deeper. Then a sudden movement caught his attention. The shadow of a tree on the right side writhed as if it were made of a mass of pure shadow, something that could not be just an illusion. His first reaction was to pause, trying to rationalize. Perhaps it was a nocturnal bird, or some animal that took advantage of the obscure to hide. But when he turned the lantern back on, the light revealed something that was difficult to understand at first glance. A shape that looked almost like a mixture of animals, of a crudeness that defied any natural logic. His eyes fixed on the figure that was moving slowly in the direction of the wooden enclosure. It was tall, and its outlines were diffuse, as if parts of it were dissolving into the same shadow that covered it. The creature's eyes sparkled in a strange, almost translucent hue, which reflected the light of the lantern with an almost mesmerizing intensity. Bruce Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. A figure that looked like a hybrid, with the stature of a human, but with parts that resembled a wild animal, a mixture of wolf, fox, and some other creature that had no name, pushed by their most primal fears. His mind was looking for explanations, but everything seemed to dissolve into the superiority of what he saw. The creature seemed to be standing still for a moment, watching, as if testing its presence there. Bruce Ethan tried to sort out his thoughts, fighting the urge to run away, to run into the house and lock all the doors, but an almost involuntary force kept him there, frozen, while the figure remained in the shadows, silent, waiting. Then he heard a sound coming from behind a tree that sounded like a muffled growl. Not an ordinary animal, but something denser, more charged with an almost otherworldly energy. The sound mixed with the wind, and Bruce Ethan wondered if it was just his imagination, fueled by fear and the stories he had heard since he was a child, or if there was something about that night that really escaped rational comprehension. It was at that moment that an idea came to him, a memory of his grandfather's old tales, that certain spirits or creatures could transform into darkness, taking forms that defy any logic of life and death. And that, in the vast stillness of the desert, the forces of other worlds manifested themselves in ways that no one could fully foresee or understand. The figure in the shadow seemed to pause, as if assessing whether Bruce Ethan was a threat or a part of his own stage of silence and mystery. Bruce Ethan tried to keep his breathing controlled, although his body was completely overwhelmed by a mixture of fascination and terror. The flashlight trembled in his hand, but he held it tight, deciding not to give up in panic. His eyes began to scan every detail, every move of the creature, as fear began to turn into an almost obsessive curiosity. How could something so strange exist in your own neighborhood? And why precisely on that night, at that time, the nature around her house seemed to be attentive, almost as if sharing the secret of that presence. Bruce Ethan could hear the rustling of the bushes in the wind, the irregular cadence of footsteps, the rustling of dry leaves under some invisible paw. It was as if the environment itself was conspiring to maintain the mystery, welcoming an entity that somehow seemed to have been there for ages, hidden in the shadows. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the creature moved again, slowly, with a grace that bordered on the supernatural. A shadow that dragged in the opposite direction, returning to the interior of the darkness, leaving Bruce Ethan with an overwhelming feeling that this had been a rapprochement, a test of his courage. And as the creature disappeared behind a wall of bushes, Bruce Ethan stood there, motionless, his lantern still lit, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In that moment, he knew that night had become a door to something he had never imagined, an encounter with what the ancient Navajo called the Skinwalker, a fear-feeding entity lurking in the shade of his own garden, waiting for the next moment, of vulnerability, and he now found himself in the midst of a mystery that he might never fully unravel, a night where terror and the unknown came together in the silent vigil of the night. The night seemed to deepen even further after the creature's silent departure in Ethan's garden. Silence enveloped his house again, but something inside him knew that it was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. The shadow that had come and gone in those first hours left an indelible mark on his mind, like a seed planted in arid soil waiting to germinate. Bruce Ethan closed the glass door tightly, holding the flashlight with trembling hands as his thoughts mingled between fear and curiosity. I wanted to understand, even without rational explanations, what that entity was and what its purpose was. At that moment, Navajo legends suggested that these creatures not only transform, but continue to evolve, gaining strength in the darkness, adapting to the expectations of those who observe them. And Bruce Ethan's impression was that the creature he had seen, or what it represented, was not a mere manifestation of fear, but an ever-changing entity, a force that fed on his anxiety, on his vulnerability, and that perhaps he was not content to just stay in the shadows. Since that night, Bruce Ethan began to notice small changes in the environment. The shadows became denser, more dangerously fluid, and the nocturnal noises seemed to intensify in a way that was unnatural. Sometimes the wind carried a kind of whisper that seemed louder, clearer. An undefined voice, a murmur that seemed to come from different corners of the garden, as if it were expanding, evolving. And each night, the creature seemed to adapt more to its own environment and, even worse, to the fear it fostered. Bruce Ethan noticed that his movements were more subtle, almost invisible, as if the entity itself had learned to avoid the light, the shadow, in a more intelligent, more predatory way. Its glowing eyes seemed more intense as Bruce Ethan tried to disguise his dread, and somehow the creature seemed to wait for moments of greater vulnerability, walking in directions it hadn't dared to explore before. Fear made Ethan desperate. But a part of him also wondered, how far could it evolve? The longer they remained in that eternal vigil, the more the creature would adjust, the more its form would transform, hide in the darkness, into forms that it could not even imagine. It was as if the very essence of supernatural forces was molding itself to their sabotaging posts, becoming smarter, more persistent. Bruce Ethan began to notice that elements that had previously seemed harmless, a tree, a bush, even the strip of light that seeped through the cracks of the window, seemed to be responding to the changes, taking on a kind of life of its own, almost as if the scenery itself was being taken over by an invisible force that adapted to the silence, to the shadows, to fear. He realized more and more clearly that this was not a fixed or one-dimensional entity. It was a force that evolved, that improved over time, becoming more and more difficult to detect, more difficult to understand. Each night, Bruce Ethan had a feeling that they should be more attentive, because what he saw at the beginning was just the beginning of a metamorphosis that could lead to something even more terrifying. This force seemed to have a will of its own, an intelligence that developed in the darkness, that evolved beyond any unheard-of logic, simply adapting to the actions and fears of those who faced it. And as the hours passed, Bruce Ethan felt that the creature or supernatural force that was chasing him expanded, growing in complexity and intensity. His contours became more diffuse, his presence more solid and threatening, as if he were learning to hide better, to hide in the very essence of the night. Like a shadow that could never be fully captured, she became smarter, quieter, looking for gaps in her defense, for moments of absolute silence in which she could feed off her anxiety. Bruce Ethan knew that somehow it was not a one-phase creature, a fixed entity, but a force that evolved, that transformed, that fed on its own inner darkness, and that had plans that were yet to be revealed. The more he tried to escape the fear, the more he felt the threat deepen, molding itself according to his emotions, amplifying his presence in the night. And so, as the sky outside remained silent, Bruce Ethan realized that his own fear, coupled with rising strength, had begun an invisible battle, a struggle where the most frightening element of all was the fact that what he faced might be evolving into something that deep down he could never fully comprehend. The night in your home ceased to be just dark, to become an arena of uncertainty, where supernatural forces molded themselves in the dim light, always ready for a new manifestation, always growing, always adapting to challenge your limited and frightening understanding of what truly dwells in the darkness. Bruce Ethan felt his breathing get heavier, as if each breath carried a greater weight than it should. The night, which had previously seemed submissively silent, began to turn into something different, something distorted. The shadows in his vision seemed to lengthen and contort, as if they had a will of their own to escape the limitations of the physical world. He tried to focus on the light from the flashlight, but the light seemed to escape his eyes, as if it was being pulled into the darkness itself. Everything around him began to seem cloudier. The trees, the plants, even the walls of his house seemed to undulate as if they were made of a malleable, almost viscous matter. Bruce Ethan bled several times in a desperate attempt to clear his vision, but the feeling persisted. Reality was fragmenting, diluting its limits, becoming something of a confusing and disconcerting reading. It was as if the world was disintegrating in front of him, leaving only a fog of doubt and uncertainty. The sounds also began to change. The once familiar wind hiss now sounded like a distorted voice, a conversation of intertwined voices, impossible to distinguish. The rustle of the leaves became a nasal whisper, like a conversation he shouldn't overhear. Each sound seemed to increase and decrease in volume at a pace that completely disoriented him. Bruce Ethan tried to cling to the images he could still make out, to the feeling of the ground beneath his feet, but even they seemed to falter. Like a painting that crumbles to the touch, the things he saw began to disappear and reappear, changing shape, color, as if they were being rearranged by an invisible force. It was like living inside a bad dream, where no one had control, where what was real today could become a lie tomorrow. His head spun with the feeling that it was all an illusion, manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension, and the intelligentsia tried, for a moment, to deny what his eyes saw. But even his mind began to fragment, feeling caught between disbelief and absolute terror. The figure that once looked like a creature now crumbled before him as if it were being eroded by darkness itself. Its contours were diluted in waves of shadow, forces that stretched and retreated like the breath of something ancestral. Bruce Ethan could almost hear a distant sound, a moan or a wail emerging from within that distortion, a macabre melody that tried to take hold of his perception. He realized that his own vision became a battleground between what his instinct said was real and what his rationality tried to deny, but which, little by little, became impossible to distinguish. At every moment, the environment seemed to transform. The trees, once solid, seemed to turn into irregular shapes, almost like faces or hands, waiting for something Bruce Ethan didn't want to acknowledge. The garden, which had once been full of reliable detail, now presented itself as a landscape of distorted dreams. A canvas where reality dissolved into patches of light and shadow that stretched and contracted without warning. The shadows lengthened, became denser, more threatening. The sky itself, which was once a dark cloak dotted with stars, became fickle, as if it were tearing apart, revealing an infinite emptiness that swallowed everything. Bruce Ethan felt his body almost weighing, as if he was being pulled by an invisible force into that void that opened up in front of him. His mind was desperately trying to cling to the thin thread of his perception, but even the idea that it was an illusion began to seem contradictory. Perhaps, he thought, this was more than an illusion. Perhaps it was a kind of invasion, a corruption of the very essence of the world, a force that fed on his doubt and fear, turning everything into a mirage of horror. The creature, which he saw as a shadow, now seemed to expand, taking on different shapes. A head with eyes that seemed to be in several places at once, a body that merged with its own environment, with the trees, with the mist. It was as if the creature was merging with the very essence of space, becoming part of the chaos. Bruce Ethan suddenly felt that he himself was perhaps becoming a part of that chaos, that his perception of being human and of reality was slowly being erased. He could no longer trust what he saw or felt, for everything seemed to be under the domination of a force that was dismantling and rebuilding itself at every moment. Everything around him was a mixture of fear, doubt, and a sense that the world he knew was nothing more than an empty shell, a temporary facade in the face of an invisible presence that consumed everything. And the more he tried to orient himself, the more he lost himself in this navigation through what seemed to be the very fabric of existence, which was crumbling in his hands. Bruce Ethan shouted, but the sound that came out of his voice was swallowed up by this perceptible corruption of reality, as if the very essence of the world was tearing apart, revealing a darkness that was beyond any understanding. In that instant he understood that the mystery he faced was not an isolated creature, but an evolving force that became more complex, more unpredictable. An entity that, instead of limiting itself to what was darkest, began to merge with the universe itself, becoming an omnipresent presence, a corruption that sacrificed the very logic of what was real to strengthen itself. And Ethan, in the midst of that whirlwind of strangeness and madness, had the impression that what he was sure was real. His house, the forest, the garden, all became a mirage, a distorted memory that escaped him as the supernatural force, more and more powerful, gained ground in his mind. In his perception, until the boundary between what is real and what is imagined was completely erased. Bruce Ethans held tight to the door handle, his fingers quivering against the worn wood. The cold breeze that came through the cracks seemed charged with an energy, charged with anguish, as if the environment itself was heavy with the decision he needed to make. The fear that once seemed like a distant shadow was now an almost physical presence, tightening his chest, suffocating his reason. He looked around, almost as if looking for a ready way out, a clear answer that could ease the pain of choosing between fleeing or staying. Every sound, every sigh seemed like a provocation to his shattered courage. Thoughts boiled inside him. A silent battle between the desire to run away from that nightmare and the urgency to confront what had tried to avoid him all night. His whole body said that escape was the safest solution, that it was easier to escape than to face the unknown. But deep down, a small light of resistance persisted, a hope that perhaps, if he decided to stay, he could understand what this monstrous force wanted and end it once and for all. Bruce Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, his heart racing in, a symphony of doubt and fear. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was just a manifestation of his own fears, a shadow created by his imagination. But the feeling that it was all more than a projection, that it really did have a purpose, made it hard to believe in its own logic. While his mind struggled with arguments, his soul felt the weight of what had to be done. If he ran away, maybe he could save his sanity, escape from that labyrinth of shadows and illusions that seemed to transform at every moment, devouring his determination. But at the same time, an incubated doubt was growing within him. What if the flight itself fueled that? What if, as he ran, he was surrendering his freedom to the creature that appeared stronger and stronger in his imagination? He felt the air grow heavier, charged with a silent threat, as if the environment itself was pressuring him to an irrevocable decision. His thoughts were torments, a mixture of courage and fear, strength and decay. And out of nowhere, an inner voice insisted, "Face or flee." He ventured to think that perhaps defeat lay in abandonment, disorderly retreat and surrender to the fear that consumed him. But there was also a part of him that cried out for survival, to escape that nightmare that seemed to seep into his own mind. A visceral battle, body and soul, which was reflected in his labored breathing and the cold sweat that ran down his forehead. Bruce Ethans felt divided. One part asking him to get up and look for a solution, while the other almost begged him to simply hide, move away, become an invisible shadow. But he knew that if he stood still, what had once begun as a struggle of emotions now turned into a concrete threat. He could feel the growing force outside, the whisper that became a scream, the shapes in the darkness more evident every moment. And with that sense of advancement came a difficult decision. He had to choose, face it, the fear, the creature, whatever, or flee in an act of despair, surrendering to emptiness. His mind swirled in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The old fears, the deepest doubts, the dreams she wished to protect all mingled in chaotic confusion. He knew that the time to act had come. But what would be the real risk? Staying could mean losing the little rationality that was still left, perhaps getting lost in the very madness that that force had unleashed. Fleeing could alleviate suffering, momentarily, or perhaps condemn you to even greater fear in the future. Bruce Ethan felt that the weight of this decision seemed greater than he could bear. Her eyes filled with silent tears as her head fought against what her heart was asking. For madness or courage, silence or ruin. Each alternative carried a promise of destruction or salvation, perhaps non-existent. His hand rested on the doorknob, a silent struggle, a war of emotions that accumulated to the limit of his resistance. If he didn't choose now, all that would be left would be the expectation of inevitable destruction, a storm that seemed to want to devour his soul. But at the same time, every fiber of his being cried out for hope, for a chance to break that cycle of horror and escape with his life. Bruce Ethan took a deep breath, his air heavy with decision, and closed his eyes for a moment, seeking a strength that seemed increasingly scarce. And in that moment of silence and conflict, he knew that his choice would define not only his destiny, but also his very essence. Face or flee, a battle without weapons, a fight of emotions on a night where reality itself seemed to be hanging on the end of a thread, about to break. Bruce Ethan sensed his body almost without strength, as if the very darkness was seeping into his bones, sapping every inch of resistance. Anxiety and fear, which once seemed like a weight on the flesh, now became an unbearable pain, an open wound that slowly bled the hope of one day finding answers. He tried to keep calm, but each breath felt like a fight against a storm that was growing inside him, a storm made up of doubts, dread, and a sense of helplessness that increased by the moment. His eyes tried to fix something familiar in the darkness, the outline of the house, a tree in the distance, anything that might bring a little stability to his mind. But it all turned out distorted, jagged, as if the universe itself had come to bow to his fear. Bruce Ethan felt her hands trembling and sweaty, her legs heavy, as if his body was slowly turning to sand, dripping through the fingers of time. He realized that his physical and mental strength was running out, consumed by that sense of absolute invulnerability. And then his eyes landed on objects around him, objects that had previously seemed harmless, ordinary, a rock, a rope, an old toolbox. But now each of them seemed charged with an inexplicable evil, a presence of his own that made him doubt his own sanity. The stone, which had previously been a simple piece of rock, seemed to acquire the form of a shadowy weapon. The rope, which it could be just an everyday object, seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, as if it had a will of its own to curl up and pull Bruce Ethan into an unknown abyss. The toolbox, which had previously held repair objects, now seemed to open its hinges, slowly, as if it were offering something hidden, a forbidden secret, a hidden threat that invited him to touch it to find out what was inside. Each of these objects, full of possibilities, became a symbol of their vulnerability. Bruce Ethan's felt small, an insect in front of something bigger, a force he couldn't understand or control. Fear consumed him, melting his courage like wax. Under the flame of a candle nearing its end, and in this phase of complete vulnerability, he realized how weak his mind was in the face of the supernatural. Every thought, every memory of courage seemed to disintegrate, dissolving into the aura of terror that surrounded him. His breathing became heavier, his teeth gritted involuntarily, his blurred vision oscillating between what was palpable and what became a shadow in his limiting quota of hope. What once had an appearance of distant threat now became a near presence, threatening to invade his soul, penetrate his vulnerability, dilate his deepest fears. Bruce Ethan felt his knees weak, a weakness that came not only from physical fatigue, but from a silent loss of inner strength. He tried to remember some moment of strength, some courage he had had before, but everything seemed distant, like a memory that escapes touch. His eyes fell on objects that were there, within his reach, and he had the bitter feeling that they could be his downfall, his weapons against what threatened him, or his weapons against himself. Each of them carried an implicit threat, a silent trap that could be activated at any moment, devouring their last stand. Bruce Ethans's vulnerability proved clearer than ever. He was not a hero. He did not possess enough strength for direct confrontation or unwavering courage. His anxiety left him in an almost intolerable state, a limbo of continuous fear that eroded his ability to act clearly. His soul, once vibrant with hope, now seemed like a candle on the verge of going out, lost in the gale of a terrifying night. He felt like a piece of paper in front of an invisible force, fragile, easily torn. The objects that, a moment before, seemed only details around him were now symbols of his own despair. Bruce Ethan realized that it all, the environment, the shadows, the creature, the objects, was an extension of his own weakness. Proof that his emotions could be manipulated, that his fear could be his most powerful weapon against himself. His eyes filled with silent tears, a demonstration of how his vulnerability persisted, a pain he didn't know how to alleviate. Every thought of struggle was mixed with a desire to give up, to hide in some dark corner and wait for the nightmare to pass. But still, a part of him tried to resist. That fragile, almost crushed hope clung to the last remaining fibers of strength. With trembling hands, Bruce Ethan felt that if he was once able to overcome his fear, something might change inside him. But in that moment, he also knew that his vulnerability had a powerful weapon, fear, which could destroy him before he could find enough courage to face whatever was in the darkness. And in his vulnerability, he felt more exposed than ever, a piece of glass about to break at the slightest touch, carrying within him the hope of strength that might not have existed. Bruce Ethan felt the weight of it all reach an unbearable point. Inside him, the darkness seemed to vibrate around her, as if she were alive, breathing, absorbing her vulnerability. All his fears, his doubts, his tears converged at that moment, forming a destructive wave that threatened to drag his courage into an endless abyss. His bright eyes, now teary, focused on the slowly approaching silhouette, more menacing than ever. The creature, with eyes that looked like two burning embers, had a presence that eclipsed everything. The silence had become a scream, the air charged with a force that tried to invade his mind, his soul. Bruce Ethan felt that this was the final moment, the instant where everything was decided. The threat began to materialize in his vision, a fusion of shadows, sharp teeth, and an unbearable presence. His knees could no longer hold. His breath turned into a sigh stuck in his throat, while his heart beat faster, almost deafening. He felt fear, a visceral pain that tightened his chest with invisible hands, threatening to suffocate him. But even in the midst of despair, a part of him, a fraction of hope or madness, cried out for him not to be defeated without a fight. He knew that this creature, whatever it was, lived by its vulnerability, by the force of fear that emanated from it. So the desire to flee no longer made sense. Bruce Ethan raised a hand slowly, as if movement was his last weapon, his final attempt to resist whatever wished to destroy him. His eyes stared at the creature, staring at every detail, every malevolent glow, every distorted outline in the darkness. Perhaps it was the hope that even so he could find a gap, a fraction of courage to challenge it head-on, and in a burst of determination that seemed to break through his own soul, Bruce Ethan screamed. A cry of resistance, of defiance, the last act of courage that came from its depths. The creature seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if surprised by this unexpected movement. His bright eyes widened a little, as if he was analyzing if he had really understood his will to fight. Bruce Ethan graced a stone that was next to him, a seemingly insignificant thing, but charged with his own strength. His fear converted into action. With all the energy he had left, he threw the stone, looking at the approaching shadow. It flew through the air, a desperate and even weak projectile in the face of its vulnerability, but it was all it had. The creature was struck, a creaking sound, a brief movement of pain, a shadow that recoiled, startled by the unexpected resistance. Bruce Ethan felt an impetus, a force that propelled him to continue, not to let himself be dominated. He moved forward, still trembling, his breathing quickening, each step a struggle with his own gossip. His hands, once unstable, now trembled. Less, a spark of courage burning inside him. Still, the threat had not completely receded. The creature, though wounded, stood there, a presence that seemed to want to devour his hope, feeding on his fear. Bruce Ethan knew that this battle was not over yet, that the real confrontation began now, there, on the fine line between flight and resistance. His eyes met the creature's eyes, and for a moment it seemed as if he was able to see it for what it really was, a shadow of a certain kind of fear that had taken shape, perhaps a manifestation of the worst he carried. And, in the face of all that, Bruce Ethan felt that his strength was renewed, not by physical strength, but by a courage that was born of his own defeat, of his most sincere vulnerability. With a desperate impulse, he tried desperately to remain calm, clear, even with his heart hammering inside his chest. The creature rushed forward, angrier, wilder, a beast that would not tolerate the burst of its resistance. Ethan, in a last act, held his breath, raised his arms, and with all the strength he had, screamed again, with a voice that came from the depths of his soul. A cry, not of fear, but of resistance, an affirmation that, even weak, he would still fight. The creature, upon hearing this scream, hesitated for a second, as if surprised by that human who, despite everything, refused to give in. And at that moment, something changed in the air, a tension that seemed primordial. The struggle finally reached its apex. Bruce Ethans threw forward, with a mixture of strength and desperation, trying to push back what threatened him. And, if for a moment he managed to look stronger, or at least firmer, it was enough to make the creature retreat a step, disconcerted by his instant courage. The night seemed to lean to his side, the light of the moon and the shadow of the creature forming a stage for a final combat, where hope was reborn in the strength of a soul that had realized the value of its own courage in the darkest hour. Bruce Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, as the creature slowly retreated into the shadow, as if he was weighing whether it was worth continuing the fight, or whether it should disappear into the darkness again. For a moment, that absolute silence seemed heavier than any noise that could exist. His fingers still held the stone, but his arms trembled with exhaustion and a fear that, though momentarily contained, still pulsated in his mind. The adrenaline began to subside, leaving room for a deeper response, more difficult to face. He felt his heart racing, each beat echoing like a sign that he had almost been consumed by what he had faced. His mind, however, was already beginning to echo questions that seemed too heavy to be carried at that moment. Has he really managed to free himself from that ancestral force? Or was it all just an illusion created by a feverish mind, a cruel play on the darkness itself? Bruce Ethan tried to make sense of what had just happened, while his body still showed the signs of an inner and outer struggle. His eyes fixed on the space where the creature had disappeared, a shadow that still seemed to pulsate, like an invisible, wound open in his vision. He sat on the stone floor, seeking stability amid a feeling of vulnerability that seemed more intense than ever. At every moment, a fresh doubt welled up in his head, a feeling that everything could come back at any moment, that terror was just waiting for a gap to return and swallow his hope. The night was still deep, charged with a nightmarish stillness, and Bruce Ethan felt it as an almost physical presence around him, as a threat that could still manifest at any time, in the next move, in the next shadow that was boldest to emerge from the darkness. He wondered if he had been really strong, or simply foolish, risking a fight against forces that were perhaps greater than he could understand or control. Every thought, every decision he had made so far, now seemed like a fragile bridge over. A dark abyss, an attempt to maintain some sanity in the tide of fear and uncertainty that consumed him. Bruce Ethan realized that no matter how much he had reacted, no matter how hard he had fought, his vulnerability remained intact, like an open wound that could not heal so easily. His mind insisted on remembering the creature, his eyes shining. In the darkness, his growl muffled and predatory. Even wounded, she could still be there, hidden in the dim light, waiting for the moment to strike again, fiercer, more cunning. It gave him chills down his spine, a feeling that his effort might have been just an advance, a small victory that could be reversed in a second when he least expected it. Bruce Ethan's skin crawled. The impression that the danger had not passed, only retreated to plan his next attack. Fear slowly seeped into his soul, enveloping him like a heavy blanket, hindering every breath, every thought. In the silence, the sound of the wind through the trees seemed to whisper promises of return, of a threat that still lurked in the shadows. Those ancient voices, which once seemed distant, echoed back in his head. Whispers of an ancient world, of creatures that feed on fear, of forces that lurk in the darkest corners of the desert. Bruce Ethan felt that he no longer had control, that his actions, no matter how brave he had done, might not be enough to protect him. The feeling of vulnerability was like an open wound that throbbed stronger and stronger, bringing a deeper understanding of how fragile it was in the face of something so old and wild. He looked around, looking for some sign that it was all over, for some ray of hope, though he knew that the night still held its secrets and dangers. The darkness next to her seemed to pulsate, as if she were alive, waiting only for the right time to return, to reappear in full force. Bruce Ethan felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of fear, guilt, and helplessness. He had acted, he had fought, but the feeling that it could come back, stronger and more insidious, was a shadow that now lodged in his mind. Even if he was there, breathing, alive, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The experience had changed something inside him, a shadow of doubt, a fear that now had a face, a presence that would not disappear so easily. And though he was exhausted, his body gave way, his heart kept racing, every thought charged with a constant invisible threat. Bruce Ethan wondered if what he had done had really been enough, or if he had actually just bought a little time, a breach of calm that could be destroyed at any moment. The night remained silent, but Bruce Ethan felt that the silence was a lie. He knew somehow that the real danger still lurked in the dim light, waiting for the moment to reveal itself again. And this certainty made her vulnerability even more present, an invisible scar that she would carry forever. Even so, he tried to stand up, seeking strength in the heavy silence that surrounded him, aware that at any moment the shadow could return, smarter, more ferocious. Bruce Ethan learned that night that fear does not disappear with an act of bravery, but that sometimes it is necessary to accept its presence, to carry it as a part of oneself, because deep down, it is also part of that fear that still haunts the darkness. Bruce Ethan remained there for an endless time, sitting on the cold floor, his breathing still heavy and his body tinged with a mixture of adrenaline and fatigue. The creature had finally retreated, fading into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but shadows that still seemed to pulsate in his mind. For a moment, he tried to convince himself that it was all over, that this horrendous night had come to an end, that the threat had dissipated in the vastness of the night. But even so, a doubt persisted, like an open wound that never completely healed. Had it really disappeared, or was she just waiting for an opportunity to come back stronger, more cunning? Bruce Ethanol surrounded her, looking for signs that danger might be closer than it seemed. The full moon cast a pale light over the garden, tracing the crooked silhouettes of the trees, while the wind whispered through the branches, carrying whispers that seemed like unintelligible words, promises that the night still held its secrets. Perhaps at that moment everything was calm. Maybe it was just the calm before the storm. But in his soul, a lingering feeling that the war between light and darkness had not ended there, in that fleeting shadow, in the creature that seemed more like a manifestation of fear itself than a mere entity. Bruce Ethan tried to stand up, his knees still shaking, his mind teeming with contradictory thoughts. What had he done? Was his courage enough? Or had he only revealed that the real horror consists in the vulnerability we all carry, hidden under the appearance of strength? His breathing slowly quieted as his mind searched for answers, for a certainty that refused to arise. The night carried in its stillness a silent danger, a threat that could be reborn at any moment, with more ferocity, with more intelligence. Bruce Ethan knew that this creature, that ancient entity that feeds on fear, did not dissipate so easily. She was just waiting for her next opportunity, her next vulnerability. And as much as his eyes tried to detect signs that everything was fine, his heart said otherwise. He felt an invisible presence, a shadow that seemed to still be there, breathing, watching, waiting. Maybe it was his conscience. Maybe it was the darkness itself feeding on his fear. But one thing was certain: he would never be the same again. It changed his perspective on what was real, on limits that might not exist, on forces that transcend any human logic. Bruce Ethan let out a heavy sigh, trying to sort out his thoughts, trying to understand what had happened, or what had never really ended. Deep down, he knew that this night would accompany him forever, like an invisible scar that he would carry in his soul. A reminder that terror is often not an isolated event, but a shadow that settles inside each one, ready to awaken with the slightest sign of vulnerability. When Bruce Ethan finally stood up, a strange feeling came over him, that it had all been a test, a cruel and inevitable lesson. Perhaps the creature would never return, or perhaps it was preparing for a rematch that he could never have foreseen. What was left of him, after all, was a quiet determination that if it came back, he would be more prepared, not with guns, but with the understanding that fear is a weapon, and that true strength lies in the acceptance of one's own fragility. The garden that once seemed like a place of innocent details, trees, shadows, the night itself, now seemed like a stage for something much bigger. Something that had no limits, that fed on emptiness, that could reappear around the next corner, the next night, the next misadventure that crossed its path. Bruce Ethanolhu took to the sky, where the stars seemed silent witnesses to his inner battle. The guilt of still feeling such adolescent fear, of still fearing the shadow that would lurk in the dim light, weighed on him. But it also carried a bitter hope. Perhaps one day he could understand all this. Perhaps one day the creature would be just a legend, a horror story that was told around campfires. But that night, while the wind still whispered dangerous promises and darkness remained a tempting invitation to the unknown, Bruce Ethan knew that terror was never fully defeated. He just slept, waiting for the right time to wake up again. And so, as the shadows lengthened and the ominous silence approached, Bruce Ethan stood there, wondering if this was just the beginning or just another chapter of a night that had never really ended. Because deep down, he knew that the real horror lies in uncertainty, in the doubt of whether the darkness had been completely vanquished after all, or whether it had just lurked itself, waiting to return with even greater force. If you liked this story the way we told it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any sinister stops that are coming. Here we are, always bringing stories that will make your hair stand on end and make you think about the fear that lurks in the shadows. So, Let's be part of this crowd that enjoys a mystery and a spine-chilling adventure. Click there, sign up, now and come with us on this journey of suspense and horror.